Thomas Jefferson, you all know him? Yes, he's one of my favorite people, actually. I close out my book with a soliloquy from Thomas Jefferson. I actually end my book with it. Because Thomas Jefferson made a statement. Here's a man highly regarded in the United States. I mean, there are more statues of him than probably anybody. And he made a statement towards the end of his life. He says, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I consider that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." You see, it haunted him to his grave because Thomas Jefferson knew. He knew what would happen. Matter of fact, he predicted exactly what we're dealing with today, what happened between people of African descent and those of European descent. Predicted it. He was a bright man. How do you reconcile behaving in such a barbaric way? Well, let's see what he said. He said blacks smelled bad and were physically unattractive. Well, this was inconsistent with his behavior because, you know, he fathered slaves, Sally Hemings. So it didn't smell that bad, huh? Now, here's a more important one. He said we required less sleep. Now, that one's more interesting to me. Why would he need to? What dissonance was he feeling that he would need to believe that blacks required less sleep? Why? What did he do? You know, he owned slaves. So what do you think? How hard do you think he worked them? What was a work day for a slave? Sunrise to sunset. But do you have any empirical evidence, Joy?
Hi guys, welcome back to our channel. In case you're new here, my name is Maren
and I'm Maureen. So you remember a few days back when we did an episode where we said palm-colored scientists have often used science as a tool of racism,
right? And in that episode we also said we stretched on the importance of melanated people going into these fields where palm-colored people are
and trying doing their own research in order for the black community to know what is being done in secret, and in order for the black community to know if this science that the white scientists are bringing us, are they fact-founded or not.
Right. So guys, in today's episode we found another black professor who is going to be disproving and debunking the fallacies put up by the white scientist here. And she's not just talking, she came with proof and years of research to back her presentation, right? So let's just watch this video and then we come back and talk about it. Consider subscribing if it's your first time here. Also, let us know what you think about this on the comment section. So let's watch.
So we go to someone named Carl von Linnaeus. Now, Carl von Linnaeus becomes an important character in this whole conspiracy of silence and legitimacy and removing the dissonance. Carl von Linnaeus developed a system based on a criterion of skin color and laid the basis for 19th century racial classification. Linnaeus properly began the science of anthropology. So here we have the father of anthropology. Although color classification of races dated back to the ancient Egyptians, anthropologists refer to Linnaeus's Systema Naturae of 1735 as the first modern study of man. While Linnaeus advanced classification with his use of a color criterion, he also fixed on his four families of man certain moral and intellectual peculiarities that continued into the 19th century anthropological vocabulary. He described Homo Americanus. Who might that be? That would be Native Americans, American Indians. Homo Americanus. And what did he say about them? He said they were reddish, choleric, obstinate, contented, and regulated by custom. Homo Europaeus, as white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by laws. Homo Asiaticus, that'd be Asians, as sallow, grave, dignified, avaricious, and ruled by opinions. And Homo Afer, as black, phlegmatic, cunning, lazy, lustful, careless, and governed by caprice. These insights into what Linnaeus defined as racial character, personality traits, behavior, intelligence, language, and a host of other related categories were transmitted into subsequent attempts at a science of classification and became more fixed than the races themselves. Not a shred of science here. But it is in a book, and it's touted as science. And what's more important, you know, my students, I teach graduate students in social work. And they'll say, but Dr. Leary, my God, we're looking at 1707 to 1778. We are, right? After all. But do you not hear these same attributions today? You know, those blacks, they're lazy, you know, all of the exact same, am I telling the truth? In your newspapers, in your accounts of them, do you not hear these very same things? So does it matter that it started in 1707 and 1778 and has no scientific merit? That's multi-generational, is it not? It's being passed along. Part of the swallowing into the social gullet. Those are the beliefs, you see. So it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. And thank you, Carl von Linnaeus. Again, he's removing the cognitive what? Don't they deserve to be treated the way we treat them? Have we not just justified what we've done? After all, I just told you this is who they are. We're not wrong. We're just trying to keep the domestic tranquility. Makes sense. I'm having a clicker thing. There we go. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Just look at him. He's not right, we could tell already. But he had to contribute his part as well. He says, now this man, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, he was an individual. How many of you are familiar with the term Caucasian? Oh, yes. Then you know Johann. He designated 5 races or varieties of man in the second edition of his work on the natural variety of mankind. His division into Caucasian, Mongolian, American, Ethiopian, and Malayan races, with the added Carl von Linnaeus descriptive peculiarities, became the subsequent basis of most 19th century anthropomedical studies. While Carl von Linnaeus founded his system principally upon skin color, Blumenbach considered a combination of color, hair, skull, and facial characteristics as fundamental means for classifying the 5 varieties of man. Central to his study was the Caucasian, a term which he originated. He took the name Caucasian, listen for the science, from Mount Caucasus because its southern slope had cradled what he felt to be the most beautiful race of men, the Georgian. The Caucasus near Mount Ararat, upon which the biblical ark came to rest after the flood, seemed the appropriate source for the original race of man. No science yet. Now I'm going to quote him. These are his words. For in the first place, the stock displays, as we have seen, the most beautiful form of the skull, from which is a mean and primeval type the others diverge by most easy gradations on both sides the 2 ultimate extremes. That is, on the one side, the Mongolian, on the other, the Ethiopian. Besides, it is white in color. Anybody here ever met a skull that wasn't? Besides, it is white in color, which we may fairly assume to have been the primitive color of mankind. Zippity-doo-dah, no science, nothing to found this whole thing. He figured white skull, humanity began white. It's scary, but it's in a book, and it's touted as science, and we swallowed it without question. But race is a concept of society that insists there is genetic significance behind human variations in skin color that transcends outward appearance. However, race has no scientific merit outside of sociological classifications. There are no significant genetic variations within the human species to justify the division of races. Mankind is one. We are one humanity. Isn't it a shame that we are still debating that in 2008? But the reason why we continue to debate it is we still try to reconcile the ugly stuff that we've never dealt with. We still want to say they deserved it, so no one has to feel bad about all of those little babies dying and ignoring the ravages of Africa and the killing young black males in urban cities, and disproportionate imprisonment and disproportionate disparities in health. Oh, it must be their fault. How do you reconcile it? You see, rather than deal with it, we just continue to try to justify the behavior. Thomas Jefferson, you all know him? Yes, he's one of my favorite people, actually. I close out my book with a soliloquy from Thomas Jefferson. I actually end my book with it. Because Thomas Jefferson made a statement. Here's a man highly regarded in the United States. I mean, there are more statues of him than probably anybody. And he made a statement towards the end of his life. He says, "Indeed, I tremble for my country when I consider that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever." You see, it haunted him to his grave because Thomas Jefferson knew. He knew what would happen. Matter of fact, he predicted exactly what we're dealing with today, what happened between people of African descent and those of European descent. Predicted it. He was a bright man. How do you reconcile behaving in such a barbaric way? Well, let's see what he said. He said blacks smelled bad and were physically unattractive. Well, this was inconsistent with his behavior because, you know, he fathered slaves, Sally Hemings. So they didn't smell that bad, huh? Now, here's a more important one. He said we required less sleep. Now, that one's more interesting to me. Why would he need to? What dissonance was he feeling that he would need to believe that blacks required less sleep? Why? What did he do? You know, he owned slaves. So what do you think? How hard do you think he worked them? What was the work day for a slave? Sunrise to sunset. But do you have any empirical evidence, Joy? Can you prove that? Because you know, if you can't write it, you know, count it and measure it, it didn't happen in European culture. Is that correct? You got to count it and measure it. How many of you have measurable objectives? Measurable outcomes. You better measure it. I don't care if you tell them. Can you tell your boss really, truly, at the end of the year, we're doing better now? I've been to work every single day I've watched, and I can guarantee you we're doing better. Is that going to fly? That would be no. That means you have to count it and measure it. And if you didn't count it and measure it, it didn't happen. So when you start looking at the notion of requiring less sleep, that's an interesting thing because I have to believe if I work you that hard. And boy, I got humbled when I found out how hard folks worked in the sugar plantations. Ooh-wee, I got humbled by how hard folks in the Caribbean were worked. But what I decided to do is I looked at the Library of Congress. Most of my work over the 9 years that it took to write the book, 6 years of that was research. The other part of it had to do with doing interviews of elders and reading slave narratives, and there are thousands of them. This is just one taken from the Library of Congress. Sarah Gudger from North Carolina wrote, "Never known nothing but work, never knew rest, felt like my back was going to break. This the gospel truth." Then I looked at what happened in the sugar plantations, and this was amazing. One final set of grim numbers underlines the way slaves on sugar plantations like Codrington, which was a plantation in Barbados, were systematically worked to an early death. When slavery ended in the United States, slaves imported over the centuries had grown to a population of nearly 4 million. When it ended in the British West Indies, total slave imports of well over 2 million left a surviving slave population of only about 670,000. More than twice as many slaves were shipped to the island of Jamaica alone than all 13 North American colonies combined. The Caribbean was a slaughterhouse. In fact, the reason why there was more importation of slaves to these plantations is because they died so frequently. They were treated so badly, ate so poorly, that females never reached their menstrual cycles. They never actually started their menstrual cycles, so they couldn't reproduce, you see. And so many of them died, they had to import more. That's how treacherous was, you lazy black folks that you are. Isn't that ironic, though? What's so ironic is black people run from the shame of feeling like they're perceived as lazy. I mean, I live with that so much that when I would go to hotels, I would leave it cleaner. Because your mother, everybody's mother taught you, leave it cleaner than you found it. So black folks are so hypersensitive, I was cleaning up the hotel room because I wouldn't want anyone to think I'm dirty, right? Now, other people in the audience that are of color, how much harder did your parents tell you you had to work to get to even? How much harder? You had to work twice as hard. Now, how come I knew that about you? How come I knew that? Think about it. And yet at the same time, white people think we're lazy, you see? But we're so hypersensitive because of the shame, right? And then our ancestors will work to death. To death. Recently, they unearthed the slave cemetery. They unearthed actually a slave cemetery in New York City. It's on Wall Street, by the way, in the shadow of the bull. Unearthed the slave cemetery, and they still to this day they're struggling. They recently, have done a lot in terms of commemoration. I went to it took me everything to get to it. They had it blocked off so you couldn't get to it, but because they didn't want to deal with it. You can't just bulldoze a cemetery. So here in all these skyscrapers in the middle of it is this little cemetery, and there are slaves in that cemetery. More important than that was what the bones told us, because now you got CSI. Hell, I can go in there and tell you what's going on now. So with the CSI thing, now they've discovered a little bit about the bones. And to me, the most phenomenal thing about the bones is what they told us about those people and how they live. Majority of the people in there were children, infants and children, high mortality, infant mortality rate. They even know what they died of. Died of malnutrition and starvation, because they could tell by the rotting of the teeth and the jawline. So even though they most likely grew food, they weren't allowed to eat it. And then they found something even more peculiar that speaks to this idea of why he believed we required less sleep. They would show a large frame man, and they would find an injury where the muscle actually detached itself from the bone as a result of exertion and not injury. Stay with me. It detaches itself from the bone as a result of exertion. That means you work so hard, the muscle detached itself from the bone. You don't see those kind of injuries in contemporary society because no one's going to work that hard. Unless, of course, you have a gun trained on you from sunrise to sunset. So we do have empirical evidence of how hard folks worked. When we start talking about chattel slavery, we're not talking about one trauma. We're not talking about a specific event. We're talking about generations of trauma with no intervention. Based on what I know about sugar plantations, tobacco, the Caribbean, what I know about American chattel slavery and the plantations there, does anyone right now ever recall mental health assistance to slaves? Anybody remember sending in the therapist after I sold off your son, daughter, raped folks? At any point? Never. Second question. After slavery was officially over, now you're free. Anybody remember any therapy then?
So guys, welcome back. Let us know what you think about this episode on the comment section. I felt like it was important for us to bring this episode to you, and one thing that I like that the professor talked about the presentation about the scientist who, I feel like racism, people normally ask when did racism begin, because
like where did it specifically come from?
Exactly. And I feel like today's episode answered that. And the professor partly it did. She was talking about the work of the scientists from 1707 to 1778, where the professor, that white professor, scientist, was studying races, the African race, American race, European race, and American was the Native Americans, and his description of them, and just a reminder, the same things he wrote in his book, the same descriptions he had of these different groups of people are the
back
same
in 1700s.
Yeah, are the same explanations that are used by this group of people for those other groups of people. You know what I mean? Yeah, and what caught my interest is how these scientists described the black people back then.
And that is still the same description that is given to everybody right now about the black people. Because according to them, black people were very lazy and they didn't know how to do anything, which
they
is
were
quite
ironical. He said lustful. And you know, let me just talk about us as Africans and the views we were given. That was before TikTok, before we started educating ourselves about these things. The views us Africans were given about black Americans, and exactly what is described here is exactly what we know.
We grew up knowing,
and what we thought to be true about black Americans, and I'm very sure exactly the same thing description was used to tell black Americans about Africans, except as they went further ahead to use the idea of poverty and malnutrition and all that, you know. So I kind of find it interesting when this woman comes and talks with proofs, evidence and facts, you know, to describe people. And do you remember how the scientists described the palm-colored people? Blue-eyed, gentle, governed by law, you know, such description. And that is what the idea that has been passed down generations to today's society about palm-colored people, you know. So just so that they can get to
just
be
the
viewed.
conditioning, you know, guys, it wasn't until we started doing this research for ourselves and knowing about you know, the circumstances in which black Americans had to break out of slavery, the circumstances in which I still don't have much information about Africans and how each country broke out of colonization. It wasn't until I started looking for these informations that I realized that then me, if I met a white person on the road, or even just a white baby, blue eyes, blonde hair, I'd start having this deep feeling of wanting to protect them. And right now I just usually ask myself, why was that the case? Why was why was I conditioned to feel like it was my duty to protect this palm-colored person?
You look at them as vulnerable. It's the narrative they push through the movies and everything we used to consume back then, you know. And then another thing also I wanted to talk about, the scientist, that particular one who said that black people smelled, black people smelled. And one valid question she asked was, if they smelled, why were you
graping them up and down the streets all over the place and fathering illegitimate children? I do feel like, but forgive me for saying this, but a person who smells will always carry that smell wherever they go. Them themselves, they'll be used to that smell, but the moment they wake up from your couch, you'll be spraying that couch with all the good perfume you have in order to just get rid of that stench, you know. So I do feel like these grapist people, they're the ones who are stinking and carrying their stink all over. So they thought it was the black people who were stinking.
No,
but they're the ones who were
some part. But you know, even if black people were taken into slavery, the conditions they were kept under, that could
they were dehumanized.
Exactly, could have necessitated them not to have a shower. But I do believe most of them tried to when they could. You know, which is different from just a minute
deliberately not
showering, which is in the case of palm-colored people. Because I want you to explain to me, why is it that
even
your descendants even today, it's
they
just
only shower 1 time a week.
It's instinctual to them to not shower,
normal.
you know, and it's very normal for them to not shower properly or wash up properly, you know. I just want that explanation, because black people were very stinky and we were very dirty. Why is it that your descendants cannot even shower properly? That is
when black people were taken out of Africa and into these slave ships, they came out of Africa knowing how to shower. And that is why you see their descendants right now in America, Jamaica, or wherever they are, they still have the concept of picking up a soap and showering every day
with a washcloth,
you know. So meaning their ancestors mothers taught their mothers and their mothers taught them, you know. It's just like when we saw 12 Years a Slave. Lupita, who acted the slave, who was, you know, her role, for those who've seen 12 Years a Slave, she would make it a point to go and collect those little bar soaps that she made in order for her to just get a decent bath, because she felt dirty after not showering for a long time. The lengths she had to go to just to get a decent bath, while her master is just anyway.
Right. So let's talk about something else. The point, the professor was trying to disprove the point that black people are lazy, and I feel like, you know, it's different when you're trying to imagine, because it's been drilled into you so much that black people are lazy, but it's different when one of your own comes out and disproves that, and she does facts. She does it with facts. She does not only just talk about it, she brings the facts out, you know. And she says the studies that were done that black men could be found with injuries, not necessarily
like torn muscles,
not necessarily coming from injuries, but because they were worn out from working very hard. And then you remember, you know, because you're reminded, they say if they know, but you still need to remind them. We needed to be reminded. You know, the black slaves who are overworked from morning sunrise to sunset, and they're not even given decent meals. Yet when their slave masters would come, they'd say, I give you free housing, I clothe you, I water you. I feel like palm-colored people have a different way of digesting things, because they purposefully they taught each other that, so that is how, you know, because I'll always emphasize on this here. There was a video on TikTok of someone a black lady who was talking about how she was living in a nice neighborhood, right? And in that nice neighborhood, of course, you'd expect only palm-colored women to live there, you know. Right. So she was explaining that she's a housewife, right? And she was enjoying the perks of getting out of the house at such a time like 11 a.m. and enjoying the sun and just walking around
with her baby.
Yeah, having her own leisure time. And that moment, she said, whenever she'd walk out of her house and meet a palm-colored person sitting on a bench in a park, they would look at her like,
you're not supposed to be here at this specific time.
You know, and you ask yourself, why does that happen? You know, another thing she said that made sense was that palm-colored women, which would apply to all of them, yeah, they don't like to be perceived as lazy
or idling around.
Don't even say idling around. The most important thing, they don't like black people to see them
and think they are not working.
Yeah, looking idle, which anyway,
she
guys,
very much was idle.
And this brings me to the point I wanted to land. Yeah, do you guys, I know you remember, but you guys just picture back in the slavery days or colonization, what white women used to do, the hard work they used to participate in.
I mean, I feel like the hardest work they did was, you know,
punish a slave. That was the hardest work they had to do, not because it was hard on them, but it required energy. Exactly. But otherwise, they used to sit around, lounge. You know, their servants would do everything for them. You know, and if you look at that cultural thing or whatever was passed down generations, you find that black people, the woman said, black people had to work twice as hard. You know, black Americans have always been told, you know, when you're going to college,
work with a palm-colored person in a certain said company, right, you as a black person have to work twice as hard in order for you to prove that you're not lazy.
Right. And even at that, they still call them lazy. Yeah.
And this is because these scientists who labeled black people, you know, lazy, you know, every demography believes them just because they've put the science in front of it has been proven. Right. Just like right now, guys, and you can disprove me if I'm wrong. Right now, for a filmmaker to want people to see their film, if they label their true story, everybody will watch it based on true story. Everybody will watch it thinking and knowing. So right now, some people might even lie with that label in their films in order to get people to watch. The same way these scientists would lie in the name of science in order for people to believe that black people were treated badly because they weren't half as human as palm-colored people.
Right. Anyway, guys, let us know what you think about this episode. We felt like it was a good digest, and we felt like it was something good to ponder on. And this is how, one work at a time, what you can, this is how we start breaking down those walls, those false walls that they built up in communities. Yeah, and I feel like when you watch such episodes, a lot of things start making sense, you know. And I feel like right now the world is at a point where, like, if some people are worried, it's for a good reason, because people are waking up.
People are waking up, not all of them at the same time, but this information has started going out there bit by bit.
Right.
You know?
So when you're happy that technology came and you're running the world, you're doing this and that, it also comes to the downside, and which is us other people getting educated about the true events that happen and the true realities of the falsehood you brought onto people in the name of science and other things.
Yeah, guys, let us know what you think about this episode, and also consider subscribing if you're new to our channel, and we'll see you on our next episode.